Hello and welcome back to online English class. Hope you guys are doing well today. Today we're going to be working on the second part of OTN 1, which is going to offer a tutorial of an analysis of one of the sources, one of the four sources in this first conversation, entitled The American Jeremiad. We're going to be looking specifically at John Winthrop's text, A Model of Christian Charity, analyzing the ways in which John Winthrop constructs and supports his central claim, and how the document relates to the issue that is raised in the prompt of the conversation that we're having today. All right, so before we do that, I just want to remind you of some tasks that you need to keep in front of you. Okay, number one, first task, need to make sure that you send email confirmation of OTN 8 and 9 by today at 3 p.m. This needs to be complete, and I need confirmation of your completion of this assignment. Number two, need to make sure that you complete your reading by next Tuesday and send me an email confirming the fact that you have read Chapter 4 of your textbook entitled Synthesizing Sources. Okay. Third thing that you need to do is continue your work on OTN 1. Last night you should have started OTN 1 by analyzing Winthrop and Douglas's arguments. Tonight you need to finish your source analysis looking at Reagan and Obama. When we get back to school on Tuesday after the long weekend, we are going to be constructing an outline that is going to offer a sample response to the prompt. And you'll be emailing that to me by the end of the day on Tuesday. Okay. Actually, I'm sorry. By the end of the day on Wednesday. Correction there. My apologies. All right. And aside from that, you need to continue drafting quarter 4 essay. All right. Your quarter 4 essay needs to get done. You need to make sure that you are keeping that in mind. Okay, so without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our work for the day. This is not going to be particularly long, right? Mostly what I want you to be doing is working independently through these sources instead of watching me work through them. But I want to give you one example of a kind of tutorial of an analysis of one of these sources and talk through the process of asking questions about the source, interrogating the source, and comparing it or connecting it back to the prompt, okay? So let's quickly review what the prompt is asking us to do, okay? So it's asking us to develop an argument about the extent to which, right, the speakers in at least 3 of the 4 documents that we have in front of us, and at least 3 of the 4 documents that we have in front of us, how the speakers view the American ideal and the extent to which that American ideal has changed over time as reflected by these very famous, very influential spokespeople of different iterations of American history and society, moving from the colonial period with Winthrop all the way to the 21st century with Barack Obama. Okay, so our job, if we want to look at it sort of graphically, is to say, all right, what is Winthrop's vision of the American ideal? Okay, we analyze Winthrop. And then we set it next to Douglas, all right? Well, what is Douglas arguing about the American ideal? Now, quick, it's very easy to misunderstand Douglas and say, well, he's obviously satirizing and mocking and denigrating the celebration of July 4th. So obviously, he just hates America. No, Frederick Douglass didn't hate America. He hated the fact that America was betraying its foundational ideals. So, in other words, what ideals are being betrayed? All right? How do they compare to Winthrop's vision of that? Do they overlap, or are they just simply apples and oranges, not connected? Right? And then, all right, we would need to layer in Reagan's perspective in his farewell address, right? Does it layer over and overlap with the visions articulated in Winthrop and Douglas, or are they just simply, once again, different? Or perhaps Reagan and Douglas are similar, but Winthrop is distinct. Okay? And then finally, what about Obama's vision in the Tucson Memorial speech? Okay? Now, obviously, they're all talking about different things, but are there points of contact that articulate and illustrate and imply a similar value, a similar central ideal that all these men seem to value equally, that ties them together as Americans? All right? Does that exist in the text? If so, what is it? If not, what's the difference? Okay? So that is the cognitive task in front of us, the interpretive task in front of us. Now, how are we going to collect evidence? Well, obviously, we need to get into analyzing the rhetoric of the document. Okay? Looking specifically at how the speaker, right, illustrates their view of the American ideal implicitly. Okay? They're not going to say that this is obviously not. These speeches are not going to say, hey, this is the way that I view the American ideal. Right? They don't say that out loud. It is implicit in the things that they view as our unifying highest values and the threats to those values articulated in their Jeremiads. Right? Okay, so let's look at let's look at our first example of our first resource from John Winthrop's A Model of Christian Charity, and work through a brief analysis together to give you a kind of example of how this work should, how you should go about this work. Now, just to give you a kind of ballpark notion, you should spend about 15 to 20 minutes with each source, analyzing each source in preparation. All right, so 15, 20 minutes, not more than that, but certainly also not less than that. All right. So the first thing we want to do is find our way to John Winthrop's A Model of Christian Charity, which is in our textbook on page 254 and page 255. Okay, so my document camera is not cool enough to see the whole book, but that's okay. Basically, what we want to do after we read this text and digest this text argument, we want to make sure that we establish a rhetorical situation of the text, and then just basically unpack the central claim, the line of reasoning developed in the text. Okay? So, what's the context? They're settling the Massachusetts Bay colony. English Puritans are seeking religious freedom for themselves in the New World. Okay, what's the exigence? Why is Winthrop speaking? What makes this a rhetorical situation? Well, he's trying to address the fears of his community and inspire communal unity, which is obviously going to be really important whenever they go into this sort of relatively unsettled landscape and begin the process of trying to figure out how to live together. Okay, the subject of the speech is pretty simple. How are we going to live in the new world? How are we going to survive? How are we going to accomplish the work that we have in front of us is how he frames it. Who's our speaker? John Winthrop. Okay, he's a political and a spiritual leader. He's a Puritan. He's a Protestant Christian speaking to an audience who are soon to be American settlers, who are very importantly Puritans or Protestant Christians, and they are also Anglo-Saxon or English. Okay, so what's the purpose? What does Winthrop do in the speech? What are his goals? Well, first, he defines who the Puritans are. He defines what their work is, and then he defines the ends or the goal of their work, and then finally explains how, and this is kind of the centerpiece of the argument, how they're going to succeed in their endeavors in the new world. Okay, and essentially the central claim developed in the text is that he is arguing it's a claim of policy, what we should do, how are we going to survive in the new world. He argues that the Puritans should make obedience to God or being faithful to God the primary goal of their community in the new world. If they do so, they will be blessed. If they fail to do so, they will be cursed. All right. So again, very simple Jeremiad. What's the ideal? faithfulness to God, to establish a Christian community that is authentically glorifying and honoring to God. What threatens that ideal? It would be very simply sin and godlessness, walking away from or not being faithful to God's law. All right, so what's his central claim? All right, well, the central claim, like I said, is that he is attempting to persuade his Puritan audience that they should obey God's law and make that their primary goal in the new world. Okay, he supports this argument essentially by first defining who his audience is. He defines them very simply as Christians knit together with bonds of love. All right, we see that on page 255 here in these opening paragraphs. All right, the second thing that he does is he describes the work that they have in hand. All right, which he argues is basically to establish, all right, importantly, to establish a church and a government. In other words, a society. In other words, a political and a moral and spiritual foundation that works together in harmony to honor God. Okay, that's their goal. Okay, to establish a society that authentically reflects their Christian values, to establish a society that authentically is oriented toward worshiping God in every aspect of their lives, both in the church and outside. Right. So, with that goal in mind, right, Winthrop answers the question, so why are we going to do that? Okay, well, he answers essentially appealing once again to the Christian identity of the audience. He says, well, we're doing this because this is our goal in pretty much everything, right? We're trying to do the most service to the Lord. We're trying to serve God and work out our salvation and obey His commandments, okay? So with those assertions in place, he then begins to explain how they should go about accomplishing that goal specifically, right? In light of their identity, in light of their work, and in light of the end goal of their work, he argues that the Puritans should, all right, and this is the sort of arguments that he offers in favor of his claim of policy. He says, you should love one another self-sacrificially in imitation of Christ. You should obey the law of God and make sure to keep faith with your covenant with Him. If you do, you will be blessed. If you don't, you will receive the wrath of God. Okay? And then he offers some sort of inspiring examples, some rhetorical examples, some figurative speech to sort of offer some promises of what the people could be like. He says they could be like a shining city on a hill, and that they should therefore, if they want to survive and thrive, just simply choose life. Okay? So, Winthrop's rhetoric, all right, the main thing that you should get here, and this is not like an exact science, you don't need to copy down all of the words that I have here, all right, this is just a summary of the basic logic or the basic structure of Winthrop's argument, okay? We could lay this out using the Toulmin model if we wanted to, okay? Winthrop argues that the Puritans should make obedience to God their primary goal in the New World. He supports his claim by arguing that first, okay, the audience is Christian. Second, that, all right, and we could go through that using that structure if we wanted to, and you can absolutely do that. But more important, all right, than that is beginning to consider our final question here. After you've read, okay, so we've read the text, we've analyzed the text, okay, we've digested the argument, and we've evaluated the line of reasoning, okay, which, by the way, all of it is based on what? All of it is based on Christian premises. Specifically, Protestant Christian premises. In other words, Winthrop's whole argument breaks down. Winthrop's whole argument loses its cogency if you don't think this is true anymore. So if this isn't true, then none of what Winthrop is saying makes sense. He knows his audience, And his ideal community is one in which Christian premises are not only at the foundation, but also at the end. Okay? So now we need to think a little bit more carefully, about how this document relates to our central question. Okay? So, how does this source connect to the main idea of the prompt? Okay? So we need to explain how the author views the American ideal, what threatens that ideal, and what the author says or implies will offer his society salvation. Well, on the most basic level, Winthrop and his audience are explicitly Christian, and so Winthrop's main goal seems to be to build a Christian society based on the protection, the preservation, and the flourish, and the desire to make the Christian church flourish. Threats to this ideal community, all right, or the threat to this ideal community is just very simply sin, disobedience to God of any kind, all right? Salvation will come to the community insofar as they imitate Christ and obey God's law, okay? So this is reflected throughout his rhetoric, all right, which operates according to exclusively Christian premises. In this sense, it would seem that Winthrop's understanding of the American ideal, so let's connect it back to our central idea here, is necessarily different than the framers of the Constitution, who prioritized human freedom and other secular ideals, like, for instance, equality or the consent of the governed, all right, above the worship of Christ. Okay? In other words, in the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution, religious freedom is enshrined over and above, right, the worship of Christ and the protection and preservation of the Christian church. It doesn't mean that the framers of the Constitution were enemies of the Christian church. It means that their foundational ideal or value existed outside of this. So, on the face of things, it would seem that Winthrop and all other subsequent American sources that we're going to look at, including Reagan, Obama, and Douglas, would necessarily have to be operating with a different foundational ideal from different value systems. But I would argue that there still is something even deeper that Winthrop shares with Douglas and Reagan and Obama. But what is it? Well, if you disagree with me, of course you can argue that there is no commonality. But if there is one, right, we need to be able to put our finger on it. We need to be able to articulate it. Okay? And then we need to be able to evidence it in the document itself. All right, so when we reconvene on Tuesday, we're going to have a sort of summative look at the rest of these documents that you need to be working through, all right, including Reagan's source and Barack Obama's source. And then we're going to be working through our outline of the line of reasoning in response to the prompt. Okay, I hope you guys have an excellent day. That's all we have in front of us for now.